Hey, what's going on there guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this video we'll be converting this picture from Jamie Street into this full 3D animation, all from using Photomotion parallax. Now with parallax you might be wondering, hey, I can see that dog sitting there, so shouldn't we use something like horizon for this one? Well, there are a few rules which you can bend. For example, in this photo you can see that the ground and the dog are kind of separated from this environment to the back here where all of these trees are. In other words, we don't see basically the ground going off into the horizon, it's perfectly flat. So it's possible to house the dog and the ground all in one 2.5D layer, and within this example that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So let's just jump into Photoshop. As usual, the first step is to create a duplicate from the background by dragging the background layer here down to the new layer button. Next, we'll want to select the quick selection tool here and begin making our selection. Now, as mentioned beforehand, we're not going to separate the dog from the ground here, as that's going to be quite difficult. If we were going to attempt that, we would have to use horizon in this example, which would potentially needlessly complicate things. Parallax is an excellent substitute here, so what we want to do is create a selection of this dog and the ground and really any foliage around this area. We'll try and be as exact as possible, although this isn't the final result of the selection, so not to worry if it's not exactly perfect at this stage. We're just talking ballpark figures after all. If it's like a small twig that's not really that important or integral to the image, which could easily be removed, don't worry about being super in detail about it. However, some small crisp surfaces we'll want to preserve, so just ensure that those are within your selection. The next step is, well, of course, to select the select and mask option at the very top of Photoshop just over here. In this menu we have access to a bunch of more advanced options in terms of tools that we can use to mask out the dog and the ground from the overall image. Firstly, let's just sort out the dog from the background. We'll zoom in to the top of his head here and use the refine edge brush here to ensure we get the fur into the selection. To use the refine edge brush, all you need to do is just adjust the size and lightly go over the edges here. Photoshop's pretty good with ambiguous edges, and the refine edge tool is amazingly helpful when gathering a selection which either has grass, fur, hair, or anything else which is quite fine. You can see here it's doing a great job, and again, all you need to do is just drag it along the edges, ensuring that the fur and the background is within your brush path. We can use this even with objects that are out of focus in either the foreground or the background, so we'll just stick to this tool for the majority of our image. This won't solve all of your problems though. As you can see here, we've got this section. Now what we want to do here is switch out to the brush tool and just add a couple of red splotches here. Then what we'll do is swap back out to the refine edge tool and distribute this around. What you're telling Photoshop is anything in red, we don't want that. So think of this as somewhat like painting and just have fun with it really. It's kind of therapeutic in a weird way. In any case, again, we have this example where there is a lot of space and we want to get rid of it. So let's just swap out for the brush again and then just add a couple of splotches here and then use the refine edge brush again to distribute that across the edges here. Now that's the technique that we're going to be using throughout this photo. Again, just switching between the refine edge brush and the brush tool when we either need an exact edge removed or just to add in areas. Again, take your time with this and just ensure that the foliage and the dog are within your selection. Once done, we're just going to head over to this output settings over here and switch this output to new layer with layer mask, and of course we're just going to hit OK. You can see now that there is this new layer on top of our copy, and that has a layer mask attached to it. What we're going to do is bring back our selection by holding Control and clicking the mask here. We'll then head over to select, then on this drop down go to modify and finally hit expand. We'll expand the selection to around 35 pixels. Now what we want to do is select this eye icon over the layer mask so we no longer see this layer, and then then enable this background copy and then of course select it. From there, all we'll need to do is just right click on the selection here and then hit fill, and then ensure that the contents is set to content aware fill, and finally just hit OK. What Photoshop will do is use an AI to guesstimate what exactly is behind the foliage when that photo was taken. Here it's worked out pretty well, and whilst it's not perfect, it hasn't left us with anything too funky. This is our clean plate, which acts as a clean representation of what was behind those layers when that photo was taken. We'll want this to be as seamless as possible, although it doesn't need to be perfect. You can see that we're not seeing the ground here, and to be honest, with this kind of animation, we don't need to. But we will want to remove these plant elements and distortions from our clean plate, of course. So we'll use the spot healing brush first to save time, and we'll use that to get rid of some of these higher definition distortions or plants that we've deliberately left out of the selection. However, we won't be using this for some of those finer details, which we'll need to finite, of course. So the next thing we'll need to do is swap out to the patch tool here and recreate some of that out of focus forest that will still exist behind the dog here, and finally swap out back to the spot healing brush to basically just dot the I's and cross the T's in terms of those out of focus elements around our image. Cool, so once we're done, let's just add in some extra elements like this fern bush here, which you can see in the animation. We've got this saved to the desktop, so we'll just drag and drop it into our project and place it in the background just behind the dog here, so it's literally just peeking out behind the ground layer here. Next, we'll copy these ferns and paste them onto the foreground instead. So we'll just have another layer of depth to play around with, and we'll just transform them and add a little bit more scale. Now, they may look a little bit pixelated in their current state, which is fine in this use case, as the detail isn't what we want. In a matter of fact, since these are in the foreground and just sort of judging by the kind of picture this is, these would actually be out of focus. If we left them like this, it would look too sharp and rather quite jarring. Again, pulling away from the overall immersion of the animation. So, with the layer selected, we'll just go up to filter here and then select blur and finally hit this Gaussian blur. We'll raise this effect to something like 20.8 here, as that's probably a good amount, and then we'll of course hit OK. Cool, so we'll probably do some small tweaking here with the transform and probably call it for this layer here. Pretty neat, and we have these fern layers in the foreground and the background, adding an extra layer of depth. So just remember, if you don't have a lot of elements within your image to make layers from, you can always just add a few in and just ensure that they fit. Okay, so most of the time we add in text via After Effects, but this time we're going to show you that you can add it in within Photoshop. What's the difference? Well, there isn't none really, just two ways to get to the same point. So we'll just create a new layer here and then use the text tool to create some text and add in this Bailey here. Next, with the move tool selected and of course the text in the window here, we'll hold Control and hit T in order to bring up transform options, and whilst holding Shift, scale it to the corners proportionately, bringing up the scale here to our liking. Now, when we do so, we can notice that there's one slight problem here, and that's some leftover noise from when we were masking using the Refine Edge brush. You can see that behind the Y here, there's this shadowy kind of look here, and that's because this mask needs just a little bit more cleaning. So we'll select the mask layer here. Note, just make sure to select the actual mask, not the image, and then we'll select the burn tool. Next, we'll just make sure that the range here is set to shadows, not midtones or highlights, and we'll begin removing some of the frizz here by just applying a gentle touch and lightly sanding down the image so we remove some of the frizz here but not destroy the overall edges. If you've taken woodworking classes, you'll probably get the gist of this pretty fast. Again, we're just sanding down a bit of the image here to get rid of this frizz that exists on top of the text. If your brush is a little bit harsh, by the way, just ensure to change the hardness, and if it's not working and seems to be making areas darker, like a little bit more contrasted, again, make sure that you have selected the actual mask instead, not the image attached to the mask. Cool, so almost done with Photoshop. The last thing to do is just name and shift these layers by where they will sit in our projection. So we'll have this background, which is our clean plate, then we'll have this Bailey text, layer 4, then layer 3, the ferns behind the dog and the ground on layer 2, and the ferns in the foreground, the out of focus ones, those are going to be layer 1, and of course, all what's left to do is save the project somewhere convenient. The next thing to do is just get access into the Parallax projection system, and we can do that by just double-clicking on the Photomotion X folder here, which houses all the projections, and then accessing the Parallax folder. Finally, all we gotta do is just double-click on this Photomotion Parallax file here. No hassle, no plugins needed, that's all you need to do. Alright, so now we're in Parallax, the next thing to do is, of course, select this Start Parallax, and then just double-click on this Add Background button when we get into the main dashboard. We'll next bring in our Photoshop project into After Effects by dragging it from our desktop or using the import function, and when we greeted with these options, we'll just ensure that the import kind is set to composition, and of course all we need to do is just hit OK. We now have all of our layers made in Photoshop separate and within our project within this project bin here. Not too bad. The next step is just to bring in our clean plate, as that's the background here. And once it's within the composition, we'll make sure, whilst holding Shift, to use the pick whip, the swirl icon, to parent all of the positioning and scaling attributes to this parent layer just over here. Now, what that will ensure is that any positioning or scaling changes that we make using this settings layer here within this part of the project will remain consistent throughout all of our layers. This will make sense in a bit, so just bear with if you're a tad confused. Now, after we've parented these two layers together, all we need to do is just scale and position the layer accordingly to our viewport. So we'll bring down the scale to something like 79% and maybe change the positioning slightly so we'll pick up more of this background. Next step, we'll just jump back into the main dashboard and then double click on this layer 1 in order to import in our first layer, aka the out of focus ferns in the foreground. So again, back in the Projects tab here, we'll see this layer 1, which we labeled earlier from within that Photoshop project, and we'll just drag and drop it down into our project and ensure to parent it whilst holding Shift using the pick whip, the swirl icon just over here. That will copy all of the attributes which we changed for our background and apply it here too, so we don't need to faff around with all of the scale and positioning attributes again. Okay, so with our foreground ferns in, let's just get to importing in our layer 2. We'll go back to the main dashboard again and we'll double click on this layer 2 button over here, and that will just let us get access into this layer 2 composition. So again, all we need to do is just go up here to the project panel, bring in this layer 2 from that Photoshop project, and then just parent it to the parent layer just above, whilst again holding Shift. We'll repeat the same with layer 3 and 4, and just because layer 4 is a text layer within Photoshop doesn't mean the process changes in the slightest. Now, the text here, once we've got it in, is slightly too close to the very top of the screen, which means we need to move down all of these layers. So what we can do is just go back into that Add Background composition, back to the area where we imported that clean plate, and just bring the whole image down ever so slightly by using that parented layer. And cool, when we check it out again, the text now has a little bit more room to breathe. Cool, and now that our text has a little bit more headroom, let's go to creating our animation now. First, we'll just change the frame count indicator to time, and then bring our playhead over here to the 5 seconds mark on the working area. Next, we'll navigate to the animation controller and select this icon at the very top of the controller here, and then we'll navigate over to Effect Controls. We won't be able to use the zoom slider here, but what we can do is use the attributes here and dial them up here and tell After Effects this is the amount of zoom that we want for our animation. Okay, cool. With that now done, let's add in some anti-clockwise rotation here by clicking on the icon to the left here this minus icon on the controller. If we navigate back to effect controls, we can change this rotation negative slider, and that will make the image rotate anti-clockwise just by a little. Finally, let's just bring this text further into view by dragging the central controller over here, which will displace all of these layers. You can see as we do so, everything close to the image, like the ferns in the foreground, the dog and ground, move a little bit more, while everything else further away moves slightly less when manipulating the controller here. Okay, so this is all right. Now that we're happy to where our end position is, let's just mark the end of our work area here by hitting N on the keyboard, and of course, let's just have a look at the animation. Not bad at all really, although we're seeing slightly too much movement on the dog and ground here. What we can do here is ensure that we see a little less animation by bringing layer 2, the dog and the ground, further to the back, and we can do so by clicking on the animation button on the dashboard and then navigating over to effect controls and changing the distance slider for layer 2. What we'll do is just drag it ever so slightly back, which will bring it closer to the background of the 3D scene, and consequently we'll see less movement from it. Remember, the further it is away from that 3D camera, the less movement you'll see. We'll also send the fern bush behind the dog further back, and we'll also do the same for the text too, in order to make sure that it's all proportional. Now what we'll do is just make sure that this seems a little bit more dynamic through the use of particles. We'll first click on the settings button on the main dashboard under the particles tab, then navigate over to effect controls and tick this checkbox under activate particles, which will activate the particle system that we have inbuilt into Photomotion. These particles are fully dynamic within the 3D scene, much like the layers, and of course there are a variety of different things that you can do with them. In this case, we'll just change the type so it fits the environment a little bit better. These fern type leaves particles aren't actually too bad, they're actually really suitable, so let's just choose them. Now let's preview it and see how it's looking thus far. Not bad at all, and we can see that the particles here are actually pretty good as they are. We don't really need to change them. However, we're not seeing those fern bushes in the foreground as much as we'd like, so let's get to changing that. We can double click on that layer 1 button over here and then get access again to this layer 1 composition where they're sitting. Now, just because they're parented to the settings parent layer doesn't mean we can't change their size and scale independently. It just means that they've been automatically scaled and positioned to there. So what we want to do is, with the Photoshop image layer selected, not the shift parent layer here, change the positioning slightly by using the selection tool, clicking and dragging it up on the viewport whilst holding shift. That way you'll be locked into moving it either vertically or horizontally. You can also of course use the base positioning attributes too of that Photoshop image layer. They're both the same thing. Okay, so back at the main dashboard, we can see that those ferns are looking a lot more prominent within the animation. Much better. Let's just make sure that everything is okay by bringing our playhead to the end of the working area and investigate what's going on. Okay, at the very end of the animation, we can add one last thing. Let's add some animated depth of field. Again, make sure that your playhead is at the very end of your working area, or at the very least where your last keyframes are before you attempt this. What we'll do is click on the animation button over here, then navigate over to effect controls to this option depth of field. We'll ramp up this attribute and then ensure that the right layer has been selected, this layer 2, aka the dog and background. We'll then tweak it a little bit further, and of course we'll navigate back to the viewport and preview what we have. Okay, so this is pretty good so far. With our playhead at the very end of the animation, the workspace, we can also add some further alterations to the zoom and end position as well, in case it's not to our liking. So at the very end of the animation, we end up on the dog in the center of the frame. Okay, so with those tweaks done, it's probably more or less complete. Let's just change the export resolution over here by clicking on the resolution button on the main dashboard here, and then navigate over to effect controls. What we'll do from there is change the resolution drop down here, which will originally be 1080p, and we'll change that over to 4K, which by the way doesn't affect your preview preview resolution within After Effects, but the final export only. Then we'll double click on this export button, which will bring us into the export composition. From there, of course, it's more or less a cakewalk. Below, of course, we have the perfect cut system, and as our playhead was already at the end of that animation, when we jumped into that export screen, it's already giving us a green light for 0 loops, aka 150 frames. However, what if we wanted 1 loop? What Photomotion Perfect Cut tells us is 300 frames. Well, we can make this 300 frames long by just going over to the time code over here to the bottom left and then changing it to frame count. From there, all we need to do is just type out 300, and that will bring our playhead to the 300 frame point, and also Perfect Cut is giving us a green light for 1 loop. That's just one way to make sure that you're on the right spot. Finally, we'll hit N on the keyboard again to mark the end of our working area, as without, we'll still be rendering out the whole of the composition, which of course we don't really want to do. From there, let's get to exporting this out of the project. We'll head up to composition and then hit this add to render queue, which will bring our work area into the After Effects render engine. From there, we'll want to change this lossless, as by default in After Effects, at least for Windows users, it will attempt to export as an AVI, which is just a ludicrous codec in this case. So after clicking on this lossless, this output module settings will appear, and we'll want to change this format from AVI, of course, to QuickTime. Of course, all you need to do from there is just hit OK. To change the output location where it's going to be saved, all you need to do is change this blue output to setting down here. In our case, it's fine, but this is something you might want to check out before hitting render. And speaking of which, the last thing to do, of course, is just hit render. Now, what if you want an MP4, of course? Well, all you need to do is just boot up Media Encoder, of course, grab that render, and then fling it into Media Encoder, just making sure that, of course, that your format is set to H.264. MP4 is just a relatively light codec, and it's best to render out an MP4, especially if you plan to send this to places like social media. And with that done, there we go, that's this animation concluded, and we have this really cool animation of this doggo. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, do feel free to check those out.